Hey everybody! Today I'm going to show you the procedure to follow if you plan to replace the valve cover gaskets on your 1993 through 1997 Ford Probe GT. Since this car was developed in conjunction with Mazda, information in this video may also be applicable to the 1993 through 2002 Mazda 626 and the 1993 through 97 MX6, though I do not personally have any experience with these vehicles. This is my 1994 Ford Probe GT. It's got a terrible name. It isn't nearly as fast as its styling would lead you to believe, but it's beautiful, it's bright red, and it's got pop-up headlights. Now, if you're watching this video, you probably have a Ford Probe GT of your own. Since your Probe is at least 23 years old, it's probably safe to assume that your car needs or has needed some work. Before I begin the gasket replacement procedure, I'll explain why I needed to replace these gaskets and some symptoms your car may exhibit if your gaskets are shot. If you're not interested in hearing any of these symptoms, or you already know that you need to replace the gaskets, just skip ahead. The sections are timestamped in the description of the video. When I first got the car about 5 years ago, it was in pretty good shape. It sat in the previous owner's garage for many years with very little use, but I believe she ran it periodically and overall she took very good care of it. That said, after I got the car and began to drive it more regularly, I noticed some engine stuttering and hesitation. I also noticed a slight burning smell. Then one day I was driving in upstate New York and the car stalled out on me when idling in a parking lot. At this point, the problem needed to be addressed. I don't remember the exact details of all the troubleshooting I did, but I believe my first thought was that the fuel system had some debris in it. After doing a bunch of troubleshooting to no success, I eventually pulled the spark plug wires and found the tips were soaked in engine oil. It seemed that the oil was leaking in from the spark plug tube seals. Obviously, this was concerning to me, and after a little research, I found out that the tube seals on the Probe GT are part of the valve cover gaskets. Anyway, I went on rockauto.com and I purchased a new wire set and a distributor cap for good measure. Once I got the parts that I ordered, I cleaned out all the old oil from the spark plug tubes, cleaned off the plugs, and I installed the wires and the distributor cap. This solved the stuttering problem entirely, and I haven't had that issue since. Now, with all that said, if you find your spark plugs drenched in oil, if your plug wires are soaked in oil and your car is stuttering or stalling, if you smell a slight burning oil smell after driving it, or if you visibly see oil leaking out from your valve covers, it's clear that your valve cover gaskets need to be replaced. Let's get started. For this job, you'll need a variety of tools and supplies. Here's a non-comprehensive list of items you'll need in no particular order. You're going to need new valve cover gaskets with tube seals and grommets, a new intake manifold gasket set, high-temp gasket sealant maker, metric sockets. You're going to encounter 8mm, 10mm, 12mm, 14mm, and 17mm. Socket extensions of various lengths, a flexible head ratchet, ratcheting box wrenches, a Phillips screwdriver, flathead screwdriver, a magnetic rod, silver aluminum anti-seize lubricant, long nose pliers for removing hose clamps, as well as flat nose pliers for removing hose clamps, a torque wrench that measures in inch pounds, a torque wrench that measures in foot pounds. You're going to need radiator fluid, a container or pan that'll fit under your car to catch the old radiator fluid, a no-spill radiator funnel if you're feeling fancy, some spare hose clamps, small size to replace the clamps that you're inevitably going to break, a magnetic tray to hold nuts and bolts, 2 pieces of cardboard, a pen or Sharpie, heavy-duty nitrile gloves, some brake cleaner, some engine degreaser, shop towels, rags, painter's tape, a shop vac, an air compressor with an air gun, a blow chuck, and a swear jar with an entire roll of quarters. I suggest using whatever you have on hand and only buying a specialized tool if you absolutely need it. That said, all the tools and supplies I previously mentioned I used during the gasket replacement. I recommend doing this job in the garage, out of the elements. If you're an amateur or an enthusiast who likes DIY repairs, this may take a few days to complete. You don't want to leave your car outside with the engine open where debris can get into it. First thing you're going to want to do is disconnect your negative battery lead. Mine has a knob that you can twist counterclockwise to disconnect the power. Yours might have the same. Next, grab your vacuum and suck up any loose dirt, debris, leaves, or anything else that's in your engine bay that could cause problem if they get inside your engine. On mine, you'll see that a mouse or squirrel decided to make his home in my engine bay at some point, so make sure you clean up any debris left behind, and make sure you don't have any animals living inside your car. Now, grab some tape. and put 6 pieces on your intake manifold and write the numbers you see in the picture here. These numbers indicate your cylinder firing order. Each of your spark plug wires goes into a specific plug correlating with its appropriate cylinder. Pull each wire from its spark plug tube one by one and label them so they match the numbers you just placed on the intake manifold. Now, as a note, don't disconnect these wires from the distributor cap. It's unnecessary to do so, and it's going to cause you a little bit more confusion when you go to put this whole thing back together. Now that you know which wire goes where, remove this hose and set it aside somewhere safe where you won't lose it or step on it. You're going to have to remove the whole air intake system, from the throttle body all the way to the front intake. Begin the removal of your air intake system by removing the 3 10mm nuts holding the plastic front intake piece in place. Also, unscrew this hose clamp connecting this piece to your air filter box. Lift up the front intake and gently twist it back and forth until it's disconnected from the air box. Put the nuts you just removed back onto their mounting studs so you don't lose them, and then set the intake somewhere safe where it won't be damaged. Now, before we finish removing the air system, we're going to drain the coolant from the radiator petcock and depressurize our fuel system. You have to do these things because if you don't, you'll have coolant dripping everywhere when you begin disconnecting hoses, and you're also at risk of causing a fire when you disconnect the fuel line attached to the injector rails. If you look down here near the bottom left-hand corner of the radiator, you're going to see a plastic cap with a little hose. This is your radiator petcock. Under the front passenger side of your car, you'll see a plastic flap. When you open this flap, it'll expose the hose attached to the radiator petcock. Place a container under this hose and make sure the container can accept at least a gallon of coolant. Then reach in through the top of your engine bay to unscrew the petcock to begin draining the fluid. I jacked up my car in order to drain the coolant, but I don't recommend doing this. I recommend draining the fluid while your car is level on the ground. I didn't have a container that would fit under the car, so I had to jack it up. Later on, while I was working and disconnecting all the hoses, more coolant leaked out after I lowered the car back down. So to avoid this, just use a shallow pan and drain the system with the car level on the ground. Now, unscrew the radiator cap here. This will allow more air to enter the coolant system, and it's going to push out any remaining coolant through the petcock. Once all the fluid is drained, close this cap, close the petcock, and close that plastic flap. Your coolant is now sufficiently drained. Safely depressurizing the fuel system is very easy. First, open your tank filler cap on the side of the car and twist the gas cap counterclockwise. You'll likely hear a hissing sound, but it's also okay if you don't. Unscrew the cap entirely and just leave it sitting in place. There's no need to let it hang outside of the car. Now, go to the fuse box in your engine bay and pop it open. You'll see a diagram on the underside of the lid. I'm pointing to the 30 amp fuse labeled 30A FPINJ. This stands for fuel pump and injectors. Pop off the white lid covering these fuses and pull the fuse shown on the lid diagram. Place the fuse somewhere safe and then reattach both the black and white lids. Congrats, your fuel system has been safely depressurized. Now that those two items are complete, we can finish removing the air system. You'll see a hose that's mounted along the outside of your air box and it connects to your intake manifold. Pull the hose off of the mounting points on the air box and disconnect it from the manifold. I put a little piece of tape on the end of the hose and on the manifold connector and labeled them with the same letter and number just to remind myself that it gets connected there. I labeled them V1 for vacuum hose 1, but you can label it anything you'd like to keep yourself organized. Next, unbuckle the two latches holding the top part of the air box to the bottom part of the air box. After this, loosen the hose clamp which secures the air cleaner intake hose to the throttle body. Also, remove the wiring harness from the bracket on the left side of the air cleaner box. With a flathead screwdriver, gently pry this black tab to the right and slip the harness off the metal mounting bracket. Be careful because these old plastic pieces are very easy to break, and additionally, disconnect this wiring harness here on the right. Now, pull this black hose from the rear of the air cleaner intake hose. With all of that done, you should be able to wiggle the top of the air box off and disconnect it from the throttle body. Keep in mind that the top of the air cleaner box also has plastic tabs on its left side that connect it to the lower half of the air cleaner box. The top of the air cleaner box and the air cleaner intake hose can easily come off in one piece. There's no need to separate them. It's a little difficult to tell from this picture, but there is another little tiny hose down here, and that connects to the back of the top half of your air box. In this picture, you can see where it connects when you reassemble this system. Now that the top half of the airbox is out of the car, remove the 3 fasteners securing the bottom half of the airbox to the car. There are 2 on the left and there's 1 on the right. I can't remember exactly, but they're either 10 or 12 millimeter. The 2 on the left are nuts on studs, and I believe the 1 on the right is a bolt. Once you remove these fasteners, pull the rest of the airbox out of the car and replace the fasteners so that you don't lose them. Congrats, your air system is now disassembled. As a side note, the mouse or squirrel living in my engine bay made its home inside my airbox. If you look here, you're going to see a jumble of spark plug wires. To make the job a little easier, I recommend removing the wires from the plastic mounting brackets attached to the intake manifold. However, I suggest leaving the wires attached to these brackets and just removing the brackets themselves from the valve cover. Put the screws back into the valve cover and then just push all the wires off to the right side so that they're out of your way. Now it's time to begin disconnecting hoses and electrical connectors, which could otherwise prevent us from removing the intake manifold. In this picture, you see I labeled this hose V2 and marked where it connects on both sides. This is one of the hoses we removed earlier, so yours is probably already sitting on a shelf or in a box somewhere. Now is also a good time to disconnect and label these 4 electrical connectors here. Also, feel free to disconnect this end of this hose now. The other end can stay attached to where it is. Here you'll see I've labeled some of the connectors. I've labeled them FI1 and FI2 because they correspond with the harnesses attached to each fuel injector rail. Feel free to label them whatever you'd like or not label them at all, but I found that labeling them made my job a little easier. An important note to make here is that after you disconnect the gray connector, you'll also want to remove the female end of the harness from the mounting bracket on the throttle body. I mistakenly didn't do this, and then I wound up pulling the wires out of the female end of the connector. I had to replace the connector entirely, so don't make the same mistake I did. See this big metal piece with a hole in it? This is an engine lift mount. This needs to be removed as well, and that can be done by unbolting this 14mm bolt at the bottom. If you look closely, you'll see another electrical harness, the white one hidden down here. You may not be able to get to it yet, but I suggest you unplug it so as not to damage that harness. Over here behind this tape, you'll see a 17mm bolt. This is a banjo bolt that feeds fuel to your injector rails. Remove this bolt, but be careful when doing so. You've got 2 copper washers which you're going to need on either side of that bolt. After you pull the banjo bolt, you'll see that 1 washer goes on each side of the fuel line, and the bolt threads through them into the injector rails. Set this bolt and the washers somewhere safe. Over here, you'll see a large hose with a compression clamp on it. Squeeze this clamp and separate the hose. Here's a better angle of that hose. I don't recall if this hose needs to be disconnected. If so, it's easy enough to get to. Now let's head toward the back of the engine bay. If you look here, you'll see the throttle cable, some electrical harnesses, and some hoses which need to be disconnected. There are also a few other things you'll need to disconnect which you can't yet see. Start by pressing the throttle down to release the end of the throttle cable. Slip the end of the cable out of its housing. The end of this cable has a little tiny metal cylinder on it that holds it in place. It should pop out very easily. Now, remove the throttle cable from its mount by pressing these 2 plastic tabs inward and then sliding it out of its mount. Be careful not to break this piece because without it, your throttle cable cannot be mounted or operated correctly. Once it's removed, disconnect these 3 connectors. Squeeze the end of this white piece to release it from its mounting bracket, and also disconnect this little black hose next to your fuel filter. Remove the bracket that was previously holding your throttle cable by removing these 2 bolts, which I believe are also 10mm. Set the bracket aside somewhere safe and put the bolts back in so you don't lose them. You'll also see these 2 bolts right here. Remove them and this U-shaped bracket will come out. Set it aside and put the bolts back. Below those bolts are another 2 bolts. Remove those bolts as well to disconnect the harnesses from the manifold. While you're back here, feel free to disconnect this hose as well. Now, with your ratchet and a long extension, remove all the visible bolts and nuts securing the intake manifold to the engine. There are 8 bolts and 4 nuts on studs that you can readily see. Mine weren't rusted, so they came off pretty easily. However, if yours are rusted, you'll need to be extremely careful not to break any of these. Come over here to the driver's side of the car and disconnect this hose at the bottom of the throttle body. With all the visible nuts and bolts removed, now we're going to tackle the most difficult part of this entire procedure. There's a bolt that is extremely difficult to reach, which you can't even see yet. If you look here, you'll see a black metal bracket and this silver part of the intake manifold. a bolt, which I believe is 12 millimeter, goes through the back side of this bracket and into the hole on the manifold. In order to get that bolt, you'll need to squeeze your hand in over here. Take a short ratchet extension with a 12 millimeter socket and try to slip it onto the head of the bolt. Now just have some patience because it's going to be very difficult to get to. If you look here, I was able to slip the socket and the extension onto the bolt. Then, with a flexible head ratchet, I was able to loosen the bolt partially. Now, don't attempt to remove the bolt entirely because your fuel lines here are in the way. Grab a 10 millimeter socket and pull these two bolts out. With those bolts removed, you'll have just enough play to push these fuel lines downward to get the clearance for your wrench. With that small amount of extra space, you should be able to put your extension back onto the hidden bolt and unscrew it. Your manifold should be free now. Lift it up partially and disconnect this hose from the stem on the valve cover. Support the intake manifold by placing a small block of wood across your valve covers. You want enough extra space to expose this area. Reach in and try to disconnect this gray fastener from this bracket. I managed to do it by pressing on the side of the tab with a very long flathead screwdriver. You should be able to lift the manifold up completely now. You'll see one black hose that connects to the plastic white tube, which then connects to a cluster of other small vacuum lines. Disconnect this little black hose. If you see any other hoses preventing you from lifting the manifold perpendicular to the engine, disconnect them, though I'm fairly certain I've covered everything you need to disconnect. I supported the manifold by looping a rope around it and then tying it to a bracket on the wall near the driver's side of the car. The throttle body is sitting in an area where the air system used to be. This was able to keep it in place while I removed the valve covers. With the intake manifold safely supported, ball up some shop towels and place them in each of these holes. Do your best not to disturb any debris yet, since you don't want anything falling into the holes. After those holes are closed up, remove the old intake manifold gaskets. With those holes sealed and the old gaskets removed, take your vacuum and suck up any loose dirt. After vacuuming, grab a rag or a shop towel and soak it with some brake cleaner. I like Brake Clean brand, but any brand is probably fine. It cuts through dirt easily and it evaporates very quickly. Wipe down the area where your manifold gaskets were previously seated. Once they're smooth and clean, cover them with some tape. Now it's time to put your artistic talents to the test. Draw, to the best of your ability, the valve cover closer to the front of the car. Draw a little circle where each retaining bolt is and label them the same way that you see here. This is the order in which these retaining bolts must be torqued later on. Don't skip this step, since you'll use this cardboard as a way to organize the different size retaining bolts. Now, do the same with the valve cover closer to the back of the engine bay and label it as you see here. Before moving forward, I want to recommend that you only do one valve cover at a time. Pull the retaining bolts from one cover, change the gasket, and put it back together before taking apart the second one. Let's start with this front valve cover. Begin by removing these two nuts and pulling this black metal plate off, then set it aside. With that plate removed, remove these two bolts and set them somewhere safe. Also, remove these 10mm bolts from the timing cover, since they secure your timing cover to the valve cover. This is where your cardboard is going to come in handy. Take a Phillips screwdriver and punch a hole where you've drawn each circle. Then, remove each retaining bolt from the valve cover and slide them into the corresponding hole on your cardboard diagram. You don't need to save the old washers and grommets, only the bolts, since your new gaskets should come with new grommets and washers. As you see here, the bolts in the middle are longer than the others. Putting them in this cardboard holder will eliminate any confusion when you're reinstalling them later. With all these bolts removed, some gentle prying will allow you to remove the valve cover easily. Take it off and set it aside. Inspect the rim of the engine where the valve cover previously sat. You'll want to wipe away any oil and then clean it off with a rag or a shop towel soaked with brake cleaner. Pay particular attention not to get any dirt into the engine and remove any old gasket sealant which may be present. Do the same for the rim of each spark plug tube. This is what your valve cover is going to look like. Pull off the old gasket and throw it away. Underneath, you'll likely have some residue from old gasket sealant which needs to be cleaned off. Have a lot of patience here. This is going to take a while. I used a small pick, a small flathead screwdriver, a toothbrush, and a brass wire brush to clean up all the little crevices. I also used brake clean, gunk engine degreaser, chem dip, and gasoline as solvents to help remove any residue. This is going to take you a very long time. Remember, the cleaner it is, the better your new gasket will seal. After using all these chemicals, I rinsed the cover out with water and then I blew it out with compressed air. After that, I just left it in the sun to dry to ensure there was no moisture in the cover. This is what your valve cover should look like when you're all done cleaning. Now you're ready to apply the gasket sealant and insert the new gasket. You can use a Q-tip, a small flathead screwdriver, or even your finger to apply the gasket sealant to all the grooves where the gasket will be seated. After applying it, make sure the coat is thin and evenly distributed. If you have any significant lumps whatsoever, it's going to prevent the gasket from seating properly and may cause a leak after you put the valve cover back onto the engine. Wipe down the inside and outside edges of the cover to remove any excess sealant. Now, take your new gasket and press it firmly into the grooves on your valve cover. If you'd like, also apply a very thin layer of gasket sealant onto the exposed side of the gasket, though it's not necessary to do so. Again, wipe away any excess sealant. Your valve cover is now ready to be reinstalled. Place your valve cover back onto your engine and ensure all the bolt holes line up properly. Insert your new washers and grommets into the appropriate holes. As I mentioned previously, the bolts along the middle of the valve cover are longer and thus accept the longer grommets. Take the bolts from your cardboard diagram and apply a small amount of anti-seize lubricant to each bolt. Then, hand screw them into the appropriate holes following the mirrored S-shaped pattern indicated by the numbers that we wrote earlier. After you've screwed them all in by hand, attach your socket wrench and short extension. Tighten each bolt evenly as you make your way around the valve cover, and do this over 2 or 3 passes. As an aside, you'll have to tighten this particular bolt with an open face ratchet since you can't fit a regular socket onto it. Once they're somewhat tight, you can torque them down to spec. According to the service manual, these bolts can be tightened anywhere between 43 and 78 inch-pounds. I torqued mine to 70 inch-pounds because I wasn't sure exactly how accurate my wrench was. Additionally, reinsert these 2 bolts from the timing belt cover. I couldn't find a torque spec for them, so I just snugged them up to the best of my ability without over-tightening them. Now that the first valve cover is complete, move on to the second one. Follow the same procedure you just performed to complete the second valve cover. Additionally, take note of the 2 bolts going through the timing cover. I believe this bracket is also secured to the valve cover, so that bolt will need to be removed in order to pull the valve cover off the car. After you finish the second valve cover, you're ready to begin reassembly. Remove the tape placed over the intake manifold holes and clean the surface off again to ensure there's no residue from the tape. Pull the shop towels out of the holes and give the area a quick vacuum to get any loose dirt. Pull out the manifold bolts and nuts and drop your new manifold gaskets into place. The cutouts in the gaskets should match the holes on the engine, so installation will be fairly obvious. No gasket sealant is required for this. Apply a small amount of anti-seize lubricant to each of the 4 studs and apply anti-seize to each of the manifold bolts. Try to tighten them all evenly and perform this tightening over 3 passes to ensure that pressure is evenly distributed. Then grab your torque wrench and tighten each bolt to approximately 14 to 19 foot-pounds. Now, all you have to do is reconnect every bracket, hose, and electrical harness. Put every bolt and nut back in its place, make sure everything is tight, and make sure you don't have any fasteners left over. Take your time and double check all your work as you put everything back together. Remember, replace any hose clamps that you may have broken, and put the copper washers back onto your fuel line. I couldn't find the torque specs for the fuel line banjo bolt, so I snugged it up and checked for leaks after starting the car later. Once everything is back together, it's time to see if your repair was successful. First, you have to repressurize your fuel system. Reinstall your fuel injector fuse and tighten your gas cap. Next, reconnect your negative battery lead. Get into the car and put the key into the ignition, but don't crank the engine. Turn the key to the on position and leave it there for about 3 seconds. Then turn it off again and do that procedure again another 2 or 3 times. This is going to prime your fuel system. Now crank the starter. Your car should start up and you shouldn't have any engine lights or codes. Go to the engine bay and check the fuel banjo bolt to make sure it's not leaking. Now you need to refill your coolant system to replace the fluid you drained at the beginning and to purge any air. To do this, I purchased the Lyle's spill-free funnel and attached it here. I'll link a good video below about purging and filling a coolant system. Once you're done filling the coolant system and purging out all the air, you are finished with this job. Give yourself a good pat on the back knowing that you saved yourself a few $1,000s in repair bills. To the few Ford Probe owners out there watching this video, I really hope this guide helps you with your repairs. And if you got any questions at all, feel free to leave a comment and I'll answer them to the best of my ability. Thanks for watching.